What if the Sumerians weren't worshipping gods, but recording visitors? What if the tablets pressed into wet clay beneath the blazing Mesopotamian sun weren't myths at all, but careful documentation of something they witnessed, something they feared would return? In the ruins of humanity's first cities, archaeologists uncovered thousands of clay tablets speaking of beings called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The scribes described them with unsettling precision, not as vague divine forces, but as physical beings with specific roles, hierarchies, and purposes. Beings who descended, who taught, who ruled, and who promised or threatened to return. So before this ancient warning pulls you deeper, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to mysteries that make you question whether mythology is just misunderstood history. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this knowledge spreading across the world, the same way those ancient scribes must have hoped their warnings would reach future generations who might understand what they were trying to preserve. Tonight, we're descending into the oldest written records of human civilization, where the boundary between gods and visitors becomes uncomfortably blurred, where astronomical precision meets divine genealogy, where creation myths contain engineering details, and where every tablet, every cylinder seal, every temple inscription seems to whisper the same unsettling question. What if they weren't writing about gods at all, but about something they desperately needed us to remember? In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard stood in the ruins of Nineveh, surrounded by fragments of what would become one of the most disturbing libraries ever discovered. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal contained over 30,000 clay tablets, and as scholars began the painstaking work of translation, they realized these weren't just administrative records or poetry. They were something else entirely. Detailed accounts of beings called the Anunnaki, described with a specificity that felt less like mythology and more like documentation. The scribes wrote about these beings the way modern scientists might catalogue a discovery with measurements, genealogies, specific functions, and most unsettling of all, timelines suggesting they would return. Imagine the weight of that moment. Layard and his team, covered in the dust of millennia, carefully extracting tablets from collapsed chambers where they had rested in darkness for over 2,500 years. Each fragment held wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script pressed into clay while it was still soft, then baked hard as stone under the Mesopotamian sun. The tablets spoke of kings and conquests, yes, but also of beings who came from the sky, who established cities, who made decisions about humanity's fate with the same administrative precision you'd find in a colonial governor's reports. There was no mysticism in the language, no vague supernatural flourishes, just names, dates, locations, and actions recorded as if the scribes were documenting events they considered historical fact. What makes Layard's discovery so unsettling isn't just what the tablets said, but how they said it. The scribes who created these records were the most educated people in their civilization, trained for years in the complex art of cuneiform writing, trusted with preserving knowledge that kings and priests considered vital. These weren't storytellers embellishing legends around a fire, they were professional record keepers, and they approached the Anunnaki with the same sober attention to detail they gave to grain shipments and building projects. When they wrote that Anu, the sky god, descended from his celestial dwelling for a specific purpose, they recorded it the way a modern clerk might note the arrival of a visiting dignitary. When they described the Council of the Anunnaki making decisions about humanity, they listed who attended, what was debated, what was decided, as if minutes from a meeting. As more tablets were translated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a pattern emerged that scholars still struggle to explain. The Anunnaki weren't just mentioned in myths and epics, they appeared in king lists, in astronomical texts, in medical documents, in agricultural records. They were woven into every aspect of Mesopotamian knowledge, as if they were an accepted part of reality, as fundamental to the world as rivers and seasons. The texts described their cities, their family relationships, their conflicts and alliances, their specific areas of responsibility. Enki governed the waters and wisdom. Enlil controlled the air and commanded authority. Ninhursag shaped living things. Inanna ruled love and war. The division was precise, territorial, almost corporate in its structure. And then there were the prophecies, scattered throughout the library like urgent notes left for future readers. References to cycles of time, astronomical calculations marking specific periods, warnings about what would happen when certain celestial alignments occurred. The scribes preserved these with the same care they gave to everything else, suggesting they believed these warnings would matter to someone someday, that whoever found these tablets would need to know what the Anunnaki had promised or threatened about their return, that the documentation wasn't just historical record but instruction manual left behind for a future generation who might face what the ancient world had faced before. But it was the word itself, always the word, that carried the real weight. Anunnaki. In the earliest Sumerian texts, dating back to 2600 BCE, they appear not as a vague pantheon, but as a specific group of deities with clear distinctions from other divine beings. The scribes were meticulous about this. There were the Igigi, the lesser gods who labored. There were the Anunnaki, the great gods of the earth and underworld, and above them all, the supreme deities. But here's what makes scholars uncomfortable. The texts treat these categories almost bureaucratically, as if describing an organizational hierarchy rather than abstract spiritual concepts, as if someone was trying to preserve an actual structure they had witnessed. The name breaks down in Sumerian as those who from heaven to earth came, or sometimes translated as princely offspring of Anu. But the context matters more than the translation. In tablet after tablet, cylinder seal after cylinder seal, the Anunnaki are presented not as invisible spiritual forces, but as physical beings with specific attributes. They have genealogies tracing back generations. They have children with each other and occasionally with humans. They eat and drink. Temples maintained regular offerings of food and beer for them, not symbolically but actually, as if someone might arrive and consume them. They have favorite cities where they dwell. They own specific items and technologies. They age more slowly than humans, but they can be wounded, can feel emotion, can make mistakes. This specificity is what separates Mesopotamian religious texts from most other ancient mythologies. Greek gods could be vague and allegorical. Egyptian deities merged and shifted in their attributes. But the Anunnaki remained consistent across thousands of years and dozens of cities. Enki, in the texts from Eridu in 3000 BCE, has the same personality, the same responsibilities, the same symbols as Enki in Babylonian texts from 1000 BCE. It's as if the scribes were maintaining historical records of real individuals, updating their activities but keeping their core identities precise and unchanging. The tablets describe approximately 50 major Anunnaki, though the total number varies depending on the text. At the top sat Anu, the Sky Father. Below him came Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, the great gods who shaped Earth's systems. Then came the next generation. Inanna, Utu, the sun god, Nanna, the moon god, Nergal of the underworld, Ninurta, the warrior. Each had specific domains, specific cities, specific symbols that mark their authority, and the texts made clear distinctions between these great Anunnaki and the Igigi, the lesser deities who numbered in the hundreds and did the actual labor of maintaining civilization before humans were created to take over that role. What scholars rarely discuss openly is how much this structure resembles not mythology but colonization. A distant ruler in a far-off capital, regional administrators with specific territories, a laboring class that eventually rebels against their conditions. the creation of a new workforce to replace them. And throughout it all, careful record-keeping that documents the hierarchy, the decisions, the conflicts, and the inevitable departure of most of these administrators, leaving humanity to manage on its own with varying degrees of instruction about what to do when, not if, they returned. There exists a document so strange that mainstream archaeology still struggles to explain it. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on multiple tablets and prisms, claims to record every ruler of ancient Mesopotamia, going back to the moment kingship descended from heaven. The earliest kings supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years. King Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. King Alulgar for 36,000 years. Modern scholars call this mythology poetic exaggeration, but the scribes who copied these numbers century after century never treated them as metaphor. They preserved them with the same careful precision they used for grain inventories and tax records, as if they believed these numbers mattered, as if something about how time was measured had changed. The king list exists in multiple copies, found in different cities, written at different times. The earliest surviving version dates to around 2000 BCE, but it clearly copies from older sources. And here's what makes it so disturbing. Every version contains the same impossible numbers for the antediluvian kings, the rulers before the Great Flood. 8 kings ruling for a total of 241,200 years. Then the flood comes, described simply as the flood swept over. After that, the reigns become more reasonable. The first king after the flood rules for 1,200 years. Then we get reigns of 600 years, 400 years. Gradually, across generations, the lifespans decrease until we reach historical kings whose reigns we can verify 30 years, 25 years, numbers that match human timescales. Imagine being a scribe in ancient Babylon, tasked with copying this document. You're educated. You understand mathematics. You use numbers every day in your work, calculating grain stores and measuring land. Yet here you are, carefully reproducing claims that a king ruled for 36,000 years without questioning it, without adding a note saying, "This seems metaphorical." You just copy the numbers exactly as they appear in the older tablet in front of you, the way you'd copy any other historical document. What would make you do that? What would make generation after generation of educated scribes preserve these numbers without skepticism? One possibility scholars rarely discuss openly. What if the numbers aren't measuring the same thing we measure? What if the early scribes were trying to translate information from a system that measured time differently, or measured something else entirely that they could only express in years? Or what if, and this is the interpretation that makes archaeologists most uncomfortable, the numbers are accurate according to how time was actually experienced by these antediluvian kings, by these beings the texts connect directly to the Anunnaki bloodline? The king list makes explicit what other texts only hint at. The earliest rulers weren't entirely human. They were placed in power by the Anunnaki, chosen from hybrid bloodlines, granted lifespans that matched their divine parentage. The text uses specific language for this. It says kingship was lowered from heaven, not developed by humans, not earned through conquest, but installed as a system from above. The antediluvian kings ruled from cities that the texts say were founded by the Anunnaki themselves: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larsa, Sippar, Shuruppak, 5 cities before the flood, each one associated with a specific Anunnaki deity who served as its patron and protector. And then came the deluge. The king list describes it simply, without detail, but everyone reading it would have known the fuller story from other texts, how the Anunnaki Council decided to destroy humanity, how Enki secretly warned the king of Shuruppak to build an ark, how the world was reshaped by water. After the flood, the text says kingship was lowered from heaven again. as if the system had to be reinstalled, rebooted. But something had changed. The new kings lived shorter lives. Their connection to the Anunnaki bloodline was diluted, or the conditions that had allowed such longevity no longer existed, or time itself operated differently in this post-flood world. As the king list moves forward through history, the reigns continue to shorten. By the time we reach the kings of Uruk, the dynasty that included Gilgamesh, we're down to 100 to 300-year reigns, still superhuman, but approaching the upper limits of what longevity myths typically claim. And Gilgamesh himself, described in the epic as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, spends his entire story seeking immortality because he knows he's going to die, knows his partial divine heritage isn't enough to grant the lifespan of the antediluvian kings or the full Anunnaki themselves. By the time the king list reaches the historical period, around 2500 BCE, the numbers match what archaeology can verify. Kings who ruled for 20, 30, 40 years, normal human lifespans. The connection to the Anunnaki has become symbolic rather than literal, claimed as divine mandate, but no longer conferring actual extended life. As if whatever genetic or environmental or technological factor that had allowed the early hybrid kings to live centuries or millennia had faded, diluted over generations until it disappeared entirely, leaving only human rulers claiming divine descent without the physical evidence to prove it. What the king list preserves, then, might be a record of genetic dilution, a chronicle of how the Anunnaki bloodline weakened over time until nothing remained but humans with myths about their divine ancestors. Or it might record changing conditions on Earth, environmental, cosmic, or otherwise, that no longer supported the longevity the earliest texts describe. Or perhaps it documents the gradual withdrawal of the Anunnaki themselves, their decreasing presence and intervention in human affairs, until they existed only in memory and religious ritual, no longer walking among humans, no longer interbreeding, no longer conferring their attributes on human bloodlines. Beneath the desert of southern Iraq lies Eridu, the oldest city anyone has ever found. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 1940s and 50s, they discovered something remarkable buried in the deepest layers: 17 successive temples, built one on top of another, stretching back to 5400 BCE. But it was the Sumerian texts about Eridu that created the mystery. They claimed it was the first city, built before the flood, where the Anunnaki first established contact with humanity, where a being named Enki, lord of the earth and waters, came to dwell among humans and teach them the arts of civilization. The texts speak of Eridu with such reverence and such specific detail that archaeologists began to wonder, were they excavating a religious site, or something that had actually functioned as a place of contact? The location itself tells a story. In ancient times, Eridu sat at the edge of the Persian Gulf, where fresh water from the Euphrates met salt water from the sea. The texts describe this mixing of waters as Enki's domain, the Abzu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, flowing up through Eridu to bring life to the surrounding lands. Today, the site is 16 kilometers from any water, surrounded by desert, silent except for wind. But when you stand among the ruins, among the collapsed mud brick walls and the sand-filled depressions that mark ancient foundations, platforms rising above seasonal floods, and at its center, even in those earliest levels, a temple. That first temple wasn't grand, just a small shrine, barely more than a hut, circa 5400 BCE. But the people kept rebuilding it in exactly the same spot. As centuries passed and the settlement grew, each new generation demolished the old temple and built a larger one directly on top, until by 3000 BCE there stood a proper temple complex with multiple chambers, courtyards, and offerings. Why that spot? Why such devotion to rebuilding in exactly that location across 1500 years? The archaeological team, led by Fuad Safar and Seaton Lloyd, couldn't find anything geologically special about the location. No natural spring, no unusual formations. Just determination, generation after generation, to maintain a sacred space that the texts say marked where Enki first made contact with humanity. The tablets describing Eridu use language that scholars struggle to interpret. They call it the oldest city, built before the flood, the place where civilization began. Not just Sumerian civilization, all civilization. Before Eridu, the texts suggest humans lived as scattered hunter-gatherers with no agriculture, no writing, no cities. Then came Eridu, and suddenly there were all these things, taught by Enki. The jump is too fast, too complete. It's the same problem archaeologists face with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, complex architecture, appearing seemingly without precursor. But at Eridu, the Sumerians left an explanation. The Anunnaki brought these skills, demonstrated them, insisted on their adoption, as if civilization wasn't invented but installed, implemented according to a plan by beings with prior knowledge of how cities should function. In the deeper excavation levels, the archaeologists found something else. Buried beneath the temple foundations were foundation deposits, small caches containing valuable objects, inscriptions, and food offerings. But unlike typical foundation deposits that ask gods to bless a building, these read more like communications, messages for Enki himself, as if the builders expected him to actually receive them, to read them, to respond. The inscriptions speak to Enki in second person, tell him what has been built and why, ask for his guidance and protection. Not prayers exactly, but reports. Updates on the status of the city, as if maintaining Eridu was fulfilling a commission, keeping up a facility that Enki would someday return to inspect. The texts describe Enki's dwelling in Eridu as Engur, house of the subterranean waters. They say it reached deep into the earth, connecting to the Abzu below. This wasn't metaphor in their understanding. They meant Enki had a physical residence that extended downward into chambers beneath the city, into the source of the fresh water that made Eridu possible. Archaeologists never found these underground chambers. The water table is too high for extensive excavation in the lower levels, but the texts are specific. Enki kept his knowledge there, his tools, the me that governed civilization. In the lower depths of his house in Eridu, he planned and created, separated from human eyes, emerging only when needed to advise or correct or teach. The city's decline matches the texts too. As the Persian Gulf receded and the waters changed, Eridu lost its position as a mixing point between fresh and salt water. By 2000 BCE, it was being abandoned. Centuries later, it was remembered only in texts as a sacred site from before the world changed. From the time when gods dwelt on earth, travelers would make pilgrimages to the ruins, leave offerings at the collapsed temple, remember that this was where it began. But whatever had made Eridu special, whatever function it served when Enki was present, that was gone. Only the memory remained, and the archaeological layers telling the story of humanity's first attempt at urbanization, guided by something the texts insist wasn't entirely human. The tablets describe Enki with uncomfortable specificity, not just as a god of wisdom, but as a teacher with a purpose. He appears in text after text, giving humanity agriculture, mathematics, writing, metallurgy, astronomy, medicine. The Mesopotamian scribes didn't attribute civilization's emergence to gradual human development. They attributed it to direct teaching from the Anunnaki, and specifically from Enki. In the myth called Inanna and Enki, he possesses things called the me-divine powers, or technologies that govern all aspects of civilization. Over 100 specific me are listed, including kingship, priesthood, truth, descent to the underworld, and ascent from the underworld. These weren't abstract concepts. The texts treat them as transferable objects, things that could be stolen, things that needed to be guarded. As if knowledge itself was technology someone had brought and could take away. Picture Enki, as the texts describe him. Not a formless divine presence, but a specific individual with consistent characteristics across thousands of years of records. He's clever, sometimes too clever. He's associated with water, with underground places, with secret knowledge. His symbol is two streams flowing from a vase representing the Tigris and Euphrates, or perhaps the flow of knowledge he brought. His sacred number is 40. His city is Eridu. His wife is Ninhursag, the mother goddess. His sons include Marduk, who later becomes Babylon's patron deity. The texts build a complete biography, a web of relationships, a personality that feels less archetypal and more individual. The stories about Enki always involve him teaching or creating or solving problems. In the Eridu Genesis, the earliest known flood narrative, Enki's the one who warns Yasudra to build an ark, disobeying the council of gods who voted to destroy humanity. In the Atrahasis epic, when the Anunnaki can't agree on what to do about humanity's noise and proliferation, Enki proposes the solution. Modify humans so they have limited lifespans and reduced fertility, managing population without complete genocide. In Enki and Ninmar, he and the mother goddess create humans from clay, experimenting with different forms, with Enki showing how even failed experiments, humans with disabilities, can have valuable roles. The texts portray him as innovative, pragmatic, protective of humanity, even when other Anunnaki want to reduce or eliminate them. But the me these require careful attention. The full list survives in Inanna and Enki, and it's bizarre. Among the me that Enki possesses and Inanna steals are things like lordship, godship, the exalted and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted, scepter, the art of metalworking, the kindling of strife, the making of judgments, decision-making, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, prostitution, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, truth, the troubled heart, and over 100 more. They're listed methodically, without hierarchy, mixing practical skills, abstract concepts, sexual practices, emotions, and abilities that sound impossible, like traveling between worlds. What were the me? The text treats them as discrete items. Enki keeps them in his shrine at Eridu. Inanna gets him drunk during a feast and systematically persuades him to give them to her, one by one. Once he agrees, she loads them onto her boat of heaven and flees to her city Uruk before he sobers up and realizes what he's done. Enki sends his assistant Izimud to retrieve them, but Inanna's already crossed into Uruk's territory, and the me can't be taken back by force from another city. The story is told with humor. Enki's embarrassed, Inanna's triumphant, but the implications are unsettling. These me are portable. They can be transferred. Cities can gain or lose them. Civilization's capabilities aren't inherent but conferred, dependent on possessing these mysterious objects or technologies that Enki brought and the Anunnaki controlled. Modern scholars call the me divine decrees, or attributes of civilization, treating them as abstract concepts given physical form in mythology. But that interpretation struggles with how specifically the texts handle them. When Inanna arrives in Uruk with the me, the text describes the city gaining actual new capabilities, not symbolic spiritual authority, but practical skills and social structures. Uruk becomes a great city specifically because Inanna brought the me there, transferring them from Enki's collection at Eridu. Other cities sought them. Wars were fought over them. They were treated as strategic resources, as sources of real power. Could the me have been actual technologies? Information storage devices? Genetic templates? The Sumerian word itself is ambiguous. sometimes translated as powers, sometimes attributes, sometimes norms. But in every story, they're treated as things that can be possessed or lost, that enable capabilities their possessor wouldn't have otherwise. When the demon Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies, possibly the master collection of me, or a device for controlling them, the entire cosmic order breaks down until it's recovered. The text suggests civilization wasn't humanity's invention, but Enki's gift. Knowledge transferred, rather than discovered, maintained through objects or technologies that could theoretically be lost if the Anunnaki departed and took them back. Which, according to the pattern of texts, is exactly what eventually happened. Every ancient culture has a flood story, but the Mesopotamian version is the oldest and the most disturbing. In the Epic of Gilgamesh and the earlier Atrahasis epic, the flood isn't a punishment from a single angry god. It's a decision made by the Council of the Anunnaki. The texts describe a meeting where the gods debate the problem of humanity. Too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. Most of the Anunnaki vote to destroy humanity through flood, but Enki, in secret, warns a human named Utnapishtim, giving him precise instructions to build a boat with specific dimensions. The text includes engineering specifications, waterproofing techniques, exactly what species of animals to bring and how many. As if someone who understood both the coming disaster and survival engineering was desperately trying to save something worth preserving. The Atrahasis epic, written around 1700 BCE, but copying older material, describes what led to the flood decision with unsettling bureaucratic detail. Humanity had multiplied across the earth. Their cities grew loud. The text says, "The land bellowed like a bull," and the god grew restless with their uproar. But this wasn't about noise pollution in any modern sense. The Akkadian word used suggests rebellion, disorder, perhaps population density approaching unmanageable levels. The Anunnaki Council convened to address what they termed the human problem, and the debate that followed reveals a disturbing hierarchy of proposed solutions. First, they tried plague. The text describes disease sent to reduce human numbers, but Enki taught humans medicine to counter it. Then drought. For 7 years, the texts say, rain didn't fall, but Enki showed humans irrigation and water management. Then famine. But again, Enki intervened with agricultural knowledge. Each attempt to control human population failed because one member of the Anunnaki Council, always Enki, subverted the plan. Finally, Enlil proposed the ultimate solution, a flood that would cover the entire earth, wiping the slate clean. And this time, Enlil demanded an oath from all the Anunnaki, including Enki, that they would not warn humanity. But Enki found a loophole. He couldn't speak directly to a human without violating his oath. So instead, he spoke to the reed wall of a house where a man named Atrahasis was sleeping. Reed wall, the text records him saying, "Pay attention to my words." He then gave detailed instructions for building a survival vessel, speaking as if to the wall, knowing Atrahasis could hear. The specifications are remarkably precise. The boat should be a cube 120 cubits on each side. It should have 7 decks. The door should be sealed with bitumen, inside and outside. Specific types of timber should be used. The roof should be reinforced. It reads less like a myth and more like an emergency engineering manual delivered under time pressure by someone who understood exactly what was coming. The flood itself is described with terrifying clarity. The Anunnaki opened the dikes of heaven. For 7 days and 7 nights, water fell from above and rose from below. The text says even the Anunnaki were frightened by what they had unleashed, that they cowered like dogs and crouched against the outer wall. Inanna wept, saying, "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods, ordering destruction of my people?" as if the reality of genocide they had voted for became horrific once implemented, as if they regretted what they had done even as it was happening. When the waters finally receded and the boat came to rest on a mountain, Utnapishtim emerged. He offered sacrifices, and the text says, the gods smelled the sweet savor and gathered like flies over the offering. They had no humans to maintain their temples, to provide food offerings, to do the work of civilization. Enlil arrived in fury, demanding to know how a human had survived. But Anu and the other Anunnaki sided with Enki. They realized they needed humanity. The decision was made then to allow humans to survive, but with modifications, shorter lifespans, increased infant mortality, limits on fertility, a managed population rather than extinction, and humanity would be allowed to rebuild, to repopulate, but always remembering that they existed at the sufferance of the Anunnaki, that their survival had been a narrow thing, and that catastrophic destruction remained possible if they became too numerous or troublesome again. The biblical flood story in Genesis is clearly derived from these earlier Mesopotamian accounts, but something was lost in translation. Noah's flood is divine judgment on wickedness. Utnapishtim's flood is population control that got out of hand. One is moral parable. The other is something darker documentation of a near-extinction event decided by vote, survived through technological knowledge, secretly transmitted by a sympathetic authority who believed humanity deserved to continue. The older story suggests that the flood wasn't punishment but maintenance, pest control, that one administrator sabotaged because he thought the pests were worth saving. In multiple Mesopotamian myths, there exists an object of ultimate power, the Tablet of Destinies. Whoever possesses it controls the fates of gods and humans alike. The myths describe battles over this tablet, thefts of it, desperate struggles to reclaim it. But here's what makes this artifact so unsettling. It's described with physical properties. It's written upon. It must be consulted. It can be worn on the chest. In the Anzu myth, the bird demon Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while the god is bathing, and the entire cosmic order collapses until it's recovered. The Sumerians weren't describing abstract authority. They were describing something physical that somehow controlled events, something that had to be protected, something that would be catastrophic if lost. The Akkadian text of the Anzu myth is quite specific. Anzu was a divine being, part bird and part lion, who served in Enlil's temple. He watched Enlil remove the Tablet of Destinies and place it aside before bathing. The tablet was described as resting on Enlil's chest, worn like a breastplate or badge of office, and Anzu, seeing an opportunity, snatched the tablet and fled to his mountain stronghold. The immediate effect was catastrophic. The text says divine order was removed, and all decrees became silent. It wasn't just that Enlil's authority was diminished, the actual functioning of reality stopped working properly. As if the tablet was less a symbol of power and more a control device, and removing it from its proper operator caused system failure. The Anunnaki Council met in emergency session. They needed a champion to recover the tablet. Whoever faced Anzu while he held the Tablet of Destinies would be fighting someone who could literally alter their fate, decree their death, unmake them with words. Several gods refused the mission. Finally, Ninurta, the warrior god and son of Enlil, agreed to attempt recovery. But he couldn't just fight Anzu directly. The text describes Ninurta receiving special weapons, special instructions, magical support from other deities. The battle itself is described in detail, arrows that Anzu turns aside with commands, attacks that fail because Anzu decrees they will fail, reality itself bending to the tablet holder's will. Ninurta only succeeds through trickery. Some versions say he cut off Anzu's wing, causing him to drop the tablet. Others say he severed the tablet's connection to Anzu, through some technical means. But once the tablet was recovered and returned to Enlil, order was restored. Divine authority functioned again. Decrees could be made and enforced. The machinery of cosmic governance resumed operation. The myth is celebrated as a victory, but the implications are deeply unsettling. If divine power required a physical object to function, if the Anunnaki themselves could be rendered powerless without this tablet, then what were they really? And what was the tablet? Across multiple texts, references appear to tablets of destinies, plural, suggesting there might be multiple devices or that copies existed. The creation epic Enuma Elish mentions Marduk receiving the tablet of destinies after defeating Tiamat, wearing it on his chest as a sign of his kingship over the gods. In other texts, Enlil holds it, or Anu holds it, passed down from supreme authority to his designated administrator. It's described as containing the destinies of everything gods, humans, cities, the natural world. Whoever consults it can know the future. Whoever commands with it can change the future. It must be protected above all else. Because in the wrong hands, it doesn't just redistribute power, it threatens the stability of existence itself. What technology could do what these texts describe? What device could allow its user to decree destinies and have reality comply? Modern readers might think of quantum computers calculating probability, or genetic databases containing the templates of all life, or some advanced AI with the power to model and manipulate complex systems. The Sumerians had no words for such things, so they described what they witnessed using the language they had. A tablet that could be written upon, that could be consulted, that conferred ultimate authority over reality itself. Whether divine magic or advanced technology, the texts insist it was real, was physical, was crucial to how the Anunnaki maintained control, and was therefore the most dangerous object in existence if it fell into unauthorized hands. At the top of the Anunnaki hierarchy sits Anu, whose very name means sky or heaven. But the texts about Anu reveal something strange. He doesn't live on Earth. He dwells in his own realm, in a place the texts call the heavenly abode, or sometimes the great above. And unlike other Anunnaki who interact constantly with humans, Anu is remote, distant, arriving only for crucial moments. When he does visit, entire cities prepare. The texts describe his arrivals with ceremony and protocol that sounds almost diplomatic, as if Earth was a colony and Anu was the distant ruler checking on operations. The question that haunts scholars is simple. If these were just gods of imagination, why did the Sumerians so carefully distinguish between those who dwelt on Earth and those who only visited from elsewhere? Anu appears in the texts primarily through his decisions and his occasional visits. He's described as living in the highest heaven, in a palace or city the texts call the Great Above, or simply Heaven An in Sumerian, from which his name derives. His throne room is described with specific architectural details. His attendants are named. His children, Enlil, Enki, Inanna among them, regularly travel between his realm and Earth. But Anu himself remains mostly absent, governing from a distance. When Anu does visit Earth, the preparations are elaborate. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes one such visit. Inanna's father Anu comes to Uruk, and the entire city is put on alert. Specific protocols must be followed. Specific offerings must be prepared. The text describes this not as a spiritual visitation, but as an actual physical arrival of an important dignitary requiring appropriate reception. And Anu doesn't stay long. He comes for specific purposes to address Inanna's complaints about Gilgamesh, to make decisions that require his ultimate authority, and then returns to his own realm. The texts make clear distinctions in terminology. When describing Anunnaki who live on Earth, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, and most others, the texts place them in specific cities with specific temples. But Anu is repeatedly described as dwelling in heaven, as if his residence isn't metaphorically above, but literally elsewhere, in a location that requires travel to reach. The Anunnaki on Earth report to him. They seek his approval for major decisions. They travel to his domain for counsels and judgments. The relationship described is less like mortals supplicating a god and more like colonial administrators reporting to a distant capital. This creates a cosmology with three distinct layers. At the bottom, Earth, where humans live and work. In the middle, the Anunnaki who dwell on Earth in their designated cities, managing human affairs and the planet's systems. And at the top, Anu's realm, where the ultimate authority resides but rarely intervenes directly, trusting his designated administrators to handle day-to-day operations. It's a hierarchy that makes sense for governance but seems strange for mythology, which typically doesn't bother with such bureaucratic layering. The question that haunts careful readers of these texts is what heaven meant to the Sumerians. Was it purely spiritual realm? Another dimension? Or were they describing a physical location they couldn't reach but believed was real, another world? Another part of the solar system, another place from which the Anunnaki originated and to which Anu had returned while leaving his children and subordinates to manage Earth. The texts never explain, treating Anu's remote dwelling as simple fact that requires no elaboration. Everyone knows where Anu lives. Everyone understands he's not here but elsewhere. Everyone accepts that the supreme authority over Earth resides in a king who rarely visits his colony, who trusts his appointed administrators to maintain order in his absence. If Anu was the distant king, Enlil was the administrator who actually ran things. The tablets give him titles like Lord Air, King of Heaven and Earth, and Father of the Gods. But his role in the texts is almost managerial. He assigns territories. He settles disputes between other Anunnaki. He makes decisions about humanity's fate and enforces those decisions. When the Anunnaki vote to send the flood, it's Enlil who ensures it happens. When they decide to grant kingship to humans, it's Enlil who lowers kingship from heaven. The texts describe him not as a remote deity to be worshipped, but as an authority figure to be consulted, negotiated with, sometimes feared. As if power on Earth was administered by someone who had been given that authority by an even higher power. Enlil's city was Nippur, considered the religious center of Mesopotamia for thousands of years. His temple there, the Ekur, meaning mountain house, was where the Anunnaki Council convened for major decisions. The texts describe these councils with the precision of meeting minutes. Who attended? What was discussed? Who voted which way? Enlil often presided but didn't always get his way. The council operated by debate and consensus, with Enlil implementing whatever decision emerged. This portrayal of divine authority as committee-based rather than absolute is unusual in ancient religious texts and gives the Mesopotamian accounts a strangely bureaucratic quality that feels less like myth and more like records of actual governance. Enlil's personality across the texts is complex. He's often the voice of harsh judgment, advocating for the flood, proposing violent solutions to problems, expressing frustration with humanity's unruliness. But he's also described as just, as following the rules even when they don't favor him, as respecting authority structures. When the council overrules him, he complies. When Enki violates his oath by warning Utnapishtim about the flood, Enlil is angry but accepts the outcome once the other Anunnaki agree humanity should survive. He represents law and order, the enforcement of decisions once made, the maintenance of hierarchy and structure. The relationship between Enlil and Enki creates constant tension in the texts. Enlil is the elder son of Anu, given supreme authority over Earth. Enki is the younger son, clever and rebellious, given dominion over the Abzu and the waters, but subordinate to Enlil's overall command. They disagree constantly. Enlil wants humanity controlled or destroyed. Enki wants humanity protected and developed. Enlil enforces rules, Enki finds loopholes. The dynamic reads less like mythological narrative and more like sibling rivalry in a royal family. Two brothers with different philosophies given overlapping authority by a distant father who won't intervene to settle their disputes. Enlil's symbol was the horned crown, which appears in art and seals as the marker of supreme divine authority. His sacred number was 50, derived from Anu's 60, indicating his position as second in the hierarchy. His children included Ninurta, the warrior god, and Nana, the moon god, and through Nana, his grandson Utu, the sun god. The family tree is meticulous, preserved across multiple texts with remarkable consistency. These weren't vague spiritual forces, but a dynasty with clear succession, clear territories, clear relationships that mattered politically. What emerges from the texts is a picture of Enlil not as a supernatural being to be worshipped from afar, but as a present authority to be dealt with. Kings travelled to Nippur to receive legitimacy from him. Cities sought his favour for protection and prosperity. When crises arose, famine, invasion, plague, humans appealed to Enlil, as one might appeal to a governor or regional commander, asking for intervention in problems they couldn't solve themselves. And Enlil responded or didn't respond based on his assessment of whether humanity deserved help, whether they had maintained proper respect, whether intervention served the larger purposes of Anunnaki governance. The relationship was transactional, conditional, political, in a way that religious texts from other cultures rarely are. Among all the Anunnaki, none is described with more complexity than Inanna, later called Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Yes, but also something more disturbing. The descent of Inanna describes her journey to the underworld with unsettling precision. She passes through 7 gates. At each gate, she must remove one item: crown, necklace, breastplate, and so on. The text gives exact descriptions of these items and the order of their removal. In the underworld, she dies and is resurrected 3 days later through the intervention of Enki. Scholars call this a myth about the seasons or the planet Venus, but the text reads more like an account of someone undergoing a dangerous procedure, someone passing through checkpoints with specific protocols, someone risking actual death to retrieve knowledge from a place humans couldn't normally access. The text begins with Inanna's decision to descend to the underworld to attend the funeral of her sister Ereshkigal's husband, the Bull of Heaven. She adorns herself carefully before the journey. The text lists each item: the crown of the step, measuring rod and line of lapis lazuli, small lapis lazuli beads around her neck, sparkling stones on her breast, gold ring in her hand, breastplate, royal robe, 7 items total. She instructs her assistant Ninshuba on what to do if she doesn't return, wait 3 days, then seek help from Enlil, then Nana, then Enki. Specific instructions, as if she knows this journey might be one way. At the first gate of the underworld, the gatekeeper demands to know why a living being seeks entry to the land of no return. Inanna claims she's come for funeral rites. The gatekeeper consults Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, who gives permission with one condition: Inanna must follow the ancient laws. The text describes each gate, each removal, systematically. First gate, crown removed. Second gate, measuring rod and line removed. Third gate, lapis lazuli beads removed. Fourth gate, sparkling stones removed. Fifth gate, gold ring removed. Sixth gate, breastplate removed. Seventh gate, royal robe removed. She arrives before Ereshkigal naked, stripped of all divine attributes and protections, and then Ereshkigal kills her. Simply, brutally, Inanna is struck dead, and her corpse is hung on a hook on the wall of the underworld. 3 days pass. Ninshuba follows the instructions, seeking help from the gods. Enlil refuses. Nana refuses. Only Enki agrees to intervene. He creates two beings from the dirt under his fingernails, neither living nor dead, able to enter the underworld without triggering its rules. He gives them the food and water of life and sends them to retrieve Inanna's corpse. They find it, sprinkle it with the food and water, and Inanna revives. But the underworld doesn't let go easily. The ancient laws require a substitute. Someone must take Inanna's place in death. She returns to the surface world accompanied by gala demons tasked with dragging someone back in her stead. She finds her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne, not mourning her at all, and in fury designates him as her replacement. The demons seize him. His sister Geshtinana volunteers to alternate with him 6 months each in the underworld, and this pattern, the text says, repeats eternally, which scholars interpret as the reason for seasonal cycles. But read without the interpretive layer, without assuming it must be seasonal metaphor. The text describes something else. A systematic stripping away of protections and attributes at multiple checkpoints. Death, resurrection after 3 days, return bearing knowledge of death and life beyond death. Enki's intervention with technology, the food and water of life that can reverse death if applied soon enough. The requirement of substitution, as if the underworld operates on balance sheets that must add up, as if death is transactional rather than final. What was Inanna retrieving? The text never explicitly says. She claims she came for funeral rites, but the narrative structure suggests another purpose, descending to gain knowledge that only death could provide. Knowledge that would distinguish her from other Anunnaki who had never crossed that boundary. After her return, Inanna is described differently in texts, with new attributes, new powers, new authority, as if whatever happened in those 3 days in the underworld changed her fundamentally, as if she had undergone an initiation, a transformation, a dangerous experiment that left her with capabilities none of the other Anunnaki possessed. The knowledge that death wasn't final, at least not for those with access to the right technology and the right intervention at the right time, before humans were created. According to the Atrahasis epic, the lesser gods called the Igigi did all the labor. They dug canals. They maintained irrigation systems. They mined ore and worked in the fields. But the text describes this not as divine activity but as exhausting physical labor that the Igigi resented. For 40 years they endured, until finally they rebelled. They threw down their tools, surrounded Enlil's house, and demanded relief. The solution the Anunnaki Council reaches is disturbing. Create a new species to do the work instead. The goddess Ninhursag mixes clay from the Abzu with the blood of a sacrificed god, and humans are created specifically to serve as workers, to bear the load of the gods. The text treats this not as poetic creation myth, but as a practical solution to a labor problem. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about the conditions that led to rebellion. The Igigi were assigned the hard labor when the Anunnaki first arrived on Earth. The great Anunnaki supervised, while the lesser Igigi did the actual work, cutting channels through rock, digging irrigation canals for 40 leagues, dredging rivers, toiling in the mines. The text uses the Akkadian word dulu repeatedly, hard labor, forced labor. The kind of work that breaks bodies and spirits. For 40 years they endured this, counted precisely in the text, as if someone was tracking exactly how long the labor force remained compliant before conditions became intolerable. Then came the breaking point. The text describes the Igigi meeting in secret, planning their action. They decided to confront Enlil directly, to demand relief from their endless labor. At night, while Enlil slept in his house in Nippur, they surrounded the building. They set fire to their tools, shovels, spades, baskets, creating a signal fire of rebellion. They declared they would work no more. The text says the god had been too heavy. Their toil had been too much. Enlil woke to find his house surrounded by rebellious gods. He was frightened. He sent for Anu, the supreme authority, and for Enki, the clever problem solver. The council convened in emergency session. Anu asked who was leading the rebellion, who should be punished. But Enlil recognized something important: the Igigi weren't wrong. The labor was indeed too heavy. They had legitimate grievance. Punishing them wouldn't solve the underlying problem. The work still needed to be done, but the Igigi could no longer be forced to do it. They needed a different solution. Enki proposed the answer. Create a new species. Take existing primitive humans, hunter-gatherers already living on Earth, and modify them. Enhance their intelligence and capability just enough to follow instructions and perform complex labor, but not so much that they would become ungovernable like the Igigi had become. The goddess Ninhursag, also called Nintu, who specialized in creating and shaping living things, would oversee the process. They would sacrifice one of the Igigi, a god named Wi-Ila or Geshtu-I, depending on the version, and mix his blood and flesh with clay from the Abzu. The divine component would give the new species intelligence and capability. The clay would keep them limited, mortal, manageable. The text describes the process with unsettling biological detail. Ninhursag takes the mixture and begins creating. She forms 14 beings, first 7 male, 7 female. But the process requires refinement. Some early attempts don't work correctly. She adjusts the mixture, the proportions, the technique. Eventually, she achieves the desired result. Humans intelligent enough to understand instructions, capable enough to work tools and follow procedures, but limited in lifespan and fertility, so they won't overpopulate uncontrollably. The text describes this as the bond of the gods. Being placed upon humans, they carry divine blood, divine capability, but diluted and constrained. The Igigi are freed from their labor. Humans take over the work of digging canals, maintaining fields, mining ore, building cities. The Anunnaki are satisfied. The problem is solved, but the implications are deeply disturbing. The text presents human creation not as special divine act for its own sake, not because the gods wanted companions or worshippers, but as pragmatic solution to a labor shortage. Humans were engineered as a workforce, designed to be smart enough to be useful, but limited enough to be controlled. The Mesopotamians believed this. They wrote it down and preserved it for thousands of years. They taught it in their temples and schools as the fundamental truth about human nature and purpose. We exist to serve. We were made for that, and our intelligence itself is a hand-me-down from a sacrificed god whose blood runs diluted in our veins. Among researchers of ancient Mesopotamia, there are whispers of texts that mainstream archaeology won't fully address. Fragments and references to tablets that describe the Anunnaki's arrival in even more detail, that give timelines and purposes that sound less like mythology and more like mission logs. Some tablets describe Enki's arrival on Earth, the establishment of settlements, the breeding of a worker species, and most intriguingly, warnings about what would happen when certain celestial cycles completed themselves. These texts exist in fragments, in references within other tablets, in scattered cuneiform inscriptions that seem to be parts of a larger narrative that was either lost, hidden, or deliberately scattered across different sites and collections, as if someone wanted the full story to be difficult to reconstruct. The problem with studying ancient Mesopotamia is that we don't have complete libraries. We have what survived in collapsed buildings, what was abandoned when cities fell, what was buried in foundation deposits. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh is the largest single find, but even that represents only what one late Babylonian king chose to collect in the 7th century BCE. Earlier tablets are referenced within it, copies of copies of copies, each scribe noting they're reproducing ancient texts from before the flood or from the time of the first cities. But the originals? Gone, destroyed in fires, dissolved in water, crumbled back into dust, or perhaps deliberately removed by people who decided certain knowledge shouldn't be widely available. In the tablets that survive, there are tantalizing references to longer works that we've never found. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions a text called The Secret of the Gods, which Gilgamesh reads on his journey, which tells him things about the past that change his understanding of mortality and divine nature. That text doesn't exist in any collection. The Eridu Genesis refers to earlier records about the founding of cities and the arrival of kingship, but those source documents haven't been discovered. Temple inventories from Babylon and Ur list tablets by name titles that sound like technical manuals, astronomical logs, histories of the Anunnaki, but the actual tablets are missing. Some scholars, the ones willing to discuss such things quietly, suggest there may have been a deliberate culling. When Christianity spread through the region, many pagan temples were destroyed, their libraries dispersed or burned. But even before that, during periods of conquest and religious reform, certain texts might have been targeted, perhaps because they contradicted official narratives, perhaps because they contained information considered too dangerous for general knowledge. The texts that survived tend to be the ones that could be interpreted as mythology, as religious literature, as poetry, the ones that read more like documentation, more like technical records, more like warnings. Those are often preserved only in fragments or oblique references. And then there are the texts that mainstream scholarship dismisses as modern fabrications. The so-called Lost Book of Enki, supposedly translated by Zechariah Sitchin, which claims to tell the story of the Anunnaki's arrival on Earth in first-person narrative. Academic Assyriologists point out, correctly, that Sitchin's translations were often wildly inaccurate, that he read Sumerian texts through the lens of his predetermined theory about alien visitors. But here's what makes the situation complicated. There are fragments of Enki narratives in genuine cuneiform tablets. There are first-person accounts attributed to Enki describing his activities on Earth. There are texts where Enki explains his reasons for helping humanity, his conflicts with Enlil, his plans and purposes. Whether Sitchin's specific compilation is authentic or synthesized from scattered sources or partly invented remains hotly debated. What's undeniable is that the ancient scribes themselves indicated they were working from incomplete information. They noted gaps in their source material. They marked places where tablets were damaged or sections were missing. They sometimes added notes like, "The rest is broken off," or "ancient copy unclear." They were aware they didn't have the full story, that pieces were missing, that the complete narrative of the Anunnaki's arrival and activities existed somewhere in fragmentary form, but couldn't be fully reconstructed. And they preserved what they had, copying it faithfully across centuries, as if hoping that someday someone would find the missing pieces and be able to assemble the complete picture. The question that keeps researchers up at night is this: if those missing pieces were found tomorrow, in some undiscovered library beneath the Iraqi desert, what would they say? Would they confirm the mythological interpretation, revealing these were always just stories about gods and metaphors? Or would they read more like the fragments we do have, more like documentation, more like records, more like warnings about cycles and returns that the ancient scribes took literally enough to preserve for 4,000 years? Here's what makes scholars truly uncomfortable. The Sumerians knew too much, too early. They had a sophisticated understanding of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25,800 years to complete. They tracked planetary movements with precision that shouldn't have been possible without advanced instruments. They divided the sky into 12 sections that became the zodiac. They knew there were planets beyond what the naked eye could see. The MUL, pin tablets, dating to around 1200 BCE but copying much older material, contain astronomical observations and calculations that suggest either centuries of careful observation or knowledge transferred from somewhere else. And throughout these astronomical texts, the movements of celestial bodies are connected to the actions and returns of the Anunnaki, as if the sky was being watched not just for seasonal markers, but for signs of when something or someone would come back. The MUL APIN tablets. Their name comes from the opening words Mul Apin, meaning star plough, referring to the constellation we call Triangulum, are essentially astronomical reference works. They list constellations, planets, stars, and their movements. They describe heliacal risings when specific stars first become visible before dawn. They track the solstices and equinoxes. They provide data for calculating the length of daylight throughout the year. This is sophisticated astronomical knowledge, requiring careful observation over long periods and mathematical ability to predict celestial patterns. But here's where it gets strange. The Sumerians knew about precession around 3000 BCE. This is the phenomenon where Earth's rotational axis slowly wobbles like a spinning top, causing the position of stars to shift very gradually over time. The entire cycle takes 25,800 years, far longer than any civilization could track through direct observation. Modern astronomers didn't rediscover precession until Hipparchus of Greece documented it in the 2nd century BCE. Yet the Sumerians incorporated precession into their astronomical calculations and, more significantly, into their mythology. They described vast cycles of time called sars, periods of 3,600 years that marked ages and returns. The MUL APIN tablets list 17 stars on the path of the moon, essentially the earliest zodiac. They identify the 5 visible planets by name: Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, Mercury, Mars, but they also reference other celestial bodies in ways that scholars struggle to interpret. They speak of bodies that cross through the heavens. They describe planetary movements with precision that requires either advanced mathematics or technological observation tools. They calculate ratios between different celestial cycles that modern astronomers confirm are accurate. Throughout these astronomical texts, the movements of planets are associated with specific Anunnaki deities. Jupiter is Marduk, Venus is Inanna Ishtar, Saturn is Ninurta, the moon is Nana, the sun is Utu. But these aren't just poetic associations. The text suggests that watching these celestial bodies was watching for the presence or return of the associated Anunnaki, as if planetary movements were somehow connected to where these beings were and when they might return to Earth. The astronomical observations weren't purely scientific, they were part of a system of monitoring, of waiting, of preparing for anticipated events. The tablets also contain something scholars call intercalation rules, methods for keeping the lunar calendar aligned with the solar year. This requires understanding that 12 lunar months don't equal one solar year, that adjustments must be made regularly, and that these adjustments follow predictable patterns. The Sumerians had this worked out in remarkable detail, suggesting either generations of careful record-keeping or transmission of knowledge from a source that already understood these cycles. And then there's what some researchers call the knowledge problem. How did a civilization that emerged seemingly suddenly around 3400 BCE with no clear developmental precursors already possess sophisticated astronomy, advanced mathematics, complex writing, urban planning, and legal systems? The standard archaeological explanation is that we simply haven't found the precursor sites yet, that development happened faster than we think, that humans are clever and figured these things out through trial and error. But the Sumerians themselves offered a different explanation. They were taught, specifically, they were taught by the Anunnaki, and primarily by Enki, who gave them the powers and knowledge systems that enabled civilization. If you were trying to preserve technical knowledge for a distant future, astronomy would be ideal. The sky is the same for everyone. Celestial cycles continue regardless of political upheaval. Star positions can serve as timestamps. The Sumerians watched the sky with devotion that seems excessive for agricultural purposes. They built observatories, they trained astronomer priests who spent their lives tracking planetary movements. They recorded everything with care that suggests it mattered beyond just predicting seasons, as if they were maintaining surveillance on something, monitoring for a specific event, watching for signs that certain cycles were completing and certain anticipated returns were approaching. In the astronomical texts, there's mention of a celestial body called Nibiru, which means crossing point or planet of the crossing. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes Nibiru as the star of the god Marduk, associated with Jupiter, but also described as something that crosses through the solar system. In the 1970s, a researcher named Zecharia Sitchin proposed that Nibiru was a hidden planet on an elliptical orbit of 3,600 years, and that the Anunnaki came from this planet. Mainstream scholars dismissed this entirely. There's no evidence for such a planet, and Sitchin's translations were often inaccurate. But here's what makes the question linger. The ancient texts do describe celestial cycles connected to the Anunnaki's presence or absence. They do treat certain astronomical events as times when the boundary between heaven and earth becomes permeable. Whether Nibiru was planet, comet, or metaphor, the Sumerians clearly believed that something in the sky marked the times of arrival and return. The word Nibiru appears in multiple contexts in cuneiform texts. Sometimes it refers to a crossing point in the sky, the celestial equator, where the ecliptic crosses, what we'd call the vernal equinox. Sometimes it's associated with Marduk specifically, as his star or planet. And sometimes it's described as something that appears periodically, that crosses through the solar system, that marks significant epochs. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic dating to around 1200 BCE, Nibiru plays a crucial role. Marduk defeats Tiamat, the primordial chaos monster, and from her body creates the heavens and earth. As reward, the other gods give Marduk supremacy and establish Nibiru as his star, his marker in the heavens. The text describes Nibiru's function. He shall be the keeper of the crossing points. It marks boundaries, transitions, significant moments when conditions change. Sitchin's interpretation was that Nibiru was a 10th planet counting the sun, moon, and 8 planets on a long elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. When Nibiru was distant, the Anunnaki were distant. When it returned, they returned with it. He proposed that the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter was the remains of Tiamat, destroyed in a cosmic collision with Nibiru in the distant past, and that this collision was what the Enuma Elish was describing in mythological language. Mainstream astronomy has never found evidence for such a planet. Orbital mechanics argue against it. The trajectories of known planets show no perturbations, suggesting a large hidden body. NASA has repeatedly stated no such planet exists. Sitchin's translations of Sumerian were demonstrably flawed. In places he made grammatical errors, imposed meanings that weren't in the original texts, read his theory into ambiguous passages. Academic Assyriologists almost universally reject his work. But here's what complicates dismissal. The Sumerians did track long cycles. They did associate astronomical events with Anunnaki activity. They did watch the sky as if waiting for something. The Sa, a period of 3,600 years, appears in their mathematical and astronomical texts as a significant cycle. The antediluvian king's reigns in the king list, when added up, produce numbers that are multiples of Sa's. The texts speak of ages, of periods when heaven and earth were in different relationships, of times when the gods were present and times when they withdrew. Whether Nibiru was planet, comet, or astronomical metaphor for a recurring cycle, the Sumerians clearly believed that something celestial marked the rhythm of Anunnaki presence and absence, that there were appointed times. that the sky held signs for those who knew how to read them. That watching planetary movements wasn't just about agriculture or astrology, but about knowing when the boundary between whatever heaven meant and earth became crossable again, when the administrators might return to check on the colony, when the cycle that had begun with their arrival might complete itself and begin again. If the tablets recorded official narratives, the cylinder seals showed something else. These small stone cylinders, carved with intricate scenes and then rolled across wet clay to create images, contain some of the most puzzling evidence about the Anunnaki. One seal, now in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, shows what appears to be a solar system with a cross or star symbol between Mars and Jupiter, where modern astronomy would later discover the asteroid belt. Another shows figures that appear to be wearing what look disturbingly like spacesuits with breathing apparatus. Others depict the Anunnaki with specific symbols: Enki with flowing water, Enlil with a horned crown, Anu with a star. But these aren't artistic interpretations. The symbols are consistent across thousands of seals over thousands of years, as if there were specific identifying markers that everyone recognized and had to reproduce correctly, the way we might identify modern organizations by their logos. Cylinder seals were the signature technology of ancient Mesopotamia. A small stone cylinder, rarely more than a few inches long, carved with a scene in negative relief. When rolled across wet clay, it produced a positive image that served as identification, authorization, proof of ownership. They were used on contracts, property boundaries, letters, storage jars. The seal was your identity, your signature, legally binding. But the images carved into these seals tell stories the tablets sometimes don't, perhaps because they were personal possessions rather than official archives, perhaps because visual imagery could preserve information differently than written text, perhaps because the seal carvers had access to traditions or knowledge that weren't part of formal literature. Whatever the reason, when you examine thousands of cylinder seals from museums worldwide, patterns emerge that complicate the official narrative. The seal, known as VA 243, held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum, has generated particular controversy. It shows a seated figure, presumably a deity or king, with other figures presenting offerings. Above them is a sun symbol with rays, clearly representing the Sunday. Surrounding it are 11 dots or small circles arranged in a pattern. Sitchin argued these represented the planets Earth, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Nibiru. Critics counter that the dots don't clearly represent planets at all, that reading them as a solar system diagram is imposing modern knowledge onto ancient art, that they're just decorative stars. But here's what's undeniable. The Sumerians did have symbols for planets. Multiple seals show planetary symbols arranged in specific ways. Multiple seals associate these symbols with particular deities. The consistency is remarkable. Enki appears with flowing water streams, often with the goatfish symbol of Capricorn. Inanna appears with the 8-pointed star of Venus. Shamash, the sun god, has rayed circles. Nanna, the moon god, has crescent symbols. These aren't variable artistic choices, they're standardized iconography, maintained across centuries and different cities, suggesting official symbols everyone understood and was required to reproduce correctly. Some seals show figures wearing what appear to be elaborate headdresses or helmets, with what look like breathing tubes. Mainstream archaeology interprets these as stylized divine crowns with ribbons, but the depictions are oddly consistent and oddly functional in appearance. Circular or cylindrical head coverings, with tubes extending down to the chest area. In one seal from around 2400 BCE, a figure approaches a seated deity while wearing one of these devices, and the detail is remarkable. Straps, rivets, a sealed unit. It looks designed, engineered, not decorative. Other seals showed technical-looking objects that resist easy interpretation. One shows figures operating what appears to be some kind of apparatus with a seated human inside, beams of light or energy emanating from it. Another shows a figure holding a handheld object pointed at another person, with symbols suggesting some kind of effect or transmission. These could be mythological scenes, they could be ritual implements, or they could be attempts to depict technology using the visual vocabulary available to ancient artists who were trying to record what they saw. The standard academic approach is to interpret everything through mythology. Any unusual object must be a symbol of divine power. Any strange scene must represent a myth we know from texts or an unknown mythological narrative. And most of the time, that interpretation probably works. But occasionally you encounter seals where the mythological interpretation requires such elaborate explanation that you wonder if the simpler answer that they were trying to depict actual objects and actual events might deserve consideration. The Sumerians weren't primitive. They were sophisticated observers who recorded what they saw with remarkable precision in their texts. Why assume their visual art was less precise, less observational, less documentary than their writing? What the cylinder seals preserve, then, might be a parallel record to the tablets. Official literature in text form, personal documentation in image form, both maintained with remarkable consistency over thousands of years, both showing the Anunnaki as specific individuals with specific symbols and specific attributes that never varied, both treating these beings as documented reality rather than imaginative creation. Whether you interpret that as religious consistency or as preservation of actual historical memory depends on how willing you are to take the ancient Mesopotamians at their word about what they were recording and why. Mesopotamian temples weren't built like religious structures in other ancient cultures. They were called ikurs, which translates to mountain house, even when built on flat plains. The ziggurats weren't just monuments, they were functional architecture designed for specific purposes. The largest, the Anunnaki in Babylon, had 7 stages of different colors, each dedicated to a different planet and Anunnaki deity. At the top was a shrine room, luxuriously appointed, where texts describe the god resting during visits. But here's the detail that disturbs archaeologists. These top shrine rooms weren't accessible to worshippers. They weren't public spaces. They were private chambers, maintained and provisioned as if someone was actually expected to use them, complete with beds, tables, and regular offerings of food and drink, as if the temples were built not for worship but for accommodation when the Anunnaki returned from wherever they had gone. Stand in the ruins of Ur, where the ziggurat of Nana still rises from the desert sand, and try to understand what you're looking at. The structure isn't designed for human congregation. There's no great hall where people could gather, no amphitheater for addressing crowds. Instead, there's a massive elevated platform accessed by steep staircases, and at the summit, a small private chamber. The effort required to build such structures was enormous, millions of mud bricks, decades of labor, resources that could have built entire neighborhoods. Yet the accessible, sacred space at the top could hold perhaps a dozen people at most. Why build a mountain if the destination is a single room? The answer lies in the texts and in the archaeological evidence from these summit shrines. At the top of the ziggurat of Marduk in Babylon, the Anunnaki, which may have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel, there was a shrine room described in detail by the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE. He reported a large couch, a golden table, and no religious statues. The room was kept luxuriously furnished, he was told, because the god would rest there when visiting, not symbolically, not spiritually, actually rest, in a physical sense, requiring an actual bed. Temple administrative texts from multiple cities describe the provisioning of these top shrine rooms. Daily bread offerings, beer in specific quantities, fine oils, incense, fresh linens for the bed. The texts are mundane, administrative, the same tone used for provisioning palace quarters for visiting dignitaries. Priests maintained these chambers as if occupancy was expected. They kept them clean, aired, supplied. For centuries after the Anunnaki supposedly departed, these practices continued. The shrine rooms sat empty but prepared, waiting for returns that the priests believed would eventually happen. The architecture itself suggests function beyond symbolism. The ziggurats were oriented precisely to cardinal directions. The summit platforms were flat, open, visible from great distances. In an era before towers or tall buildings, these would be the highest points in any city, the most visible landmarks for miles around. If something or someone was arriving from above, these platforms would serve as obvious markers, designated landing zones. The texts use the word descend when describing the Anunnaki's arrival at temples. They descend from heaven to the summit, then descend the stairs to interact with humans below. The seven-stage design of the Etemenanki corresponds to the seven planetary bodies known to the ancients: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Each level was colored differently: black bitumen for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars, golden for the Sunday. Walking up the ziggurat was walking through the celestial hierarchy, moving from earth toward heaven, from human realm toward divine realm. The summit shrine represented the crossing point, the interface, the place where two domains met. Other temple features reinforce this sense of function over pure worship. Many temples had underground chambers, deep rooms accessed by stairs going down, sometimes extending far below ground level. These lower chambers, opposite to the high shrine rooms, were called the Abzu chambers, or underworld access points. As if the temples were designed to facilitate movement in both directions: ascent to meet visitors from above, descent to access whatever knowledge or power resided in the depths below. The texts describe protocols for divine visits, specific rituals of reception, specific purification requirements for priests who would attend the visiting deity, specific foods and drink to be offered, specific timing based on astronomical observations. This reads less like religious ceremony and more like diplomatic protocol, as if the temples maintained standard operating procedures for hosting important visitors, procedures refined over centuries and maintained even after the visits stopped happening, kept current just in case the protocols would someday be needed again. Throughout Mesopotamian texts, there's an obsession with genealogy, with tracking bloodlines, with distinguishing between fully human lineages and those descended from unions between Anunnaki and humans. The kings claimed descent from gods not as poetic metaphor, but as literal ancestry. The text known as the Sumerian king list carefully notes when kings were sons of gods versus ordinary succession. The Epic of Gilgamesh identifies its hero as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, and this ratio seems to matter, seems to explain his extraordinary abilities and his quest for immortality. Why would the scribes be so careful about these distinctions unless they believed genetic heritage from the Anunnaki actually conveyed something measurable, something that affected lifespan or capability or authority? As if hybridization had been attempted with specific purposes and varying degrees of success. The genealogies are everywhere in Mesopotamian texts, traced with precision that rivals modern genealogical databases. Kings didn't just claim divine descent vaguely, they specified which god, through which lineage, with what degree of mixture. The Sumerian king list marks certain kings as son of so-and-so deity, indicating direct hybrid offspring. Others are simply listed by human parentage, indicating the divine bloodline had ended or diluted beyond significance. Gilgamesh is the most famous example. The texts are explicit. His mother was Ninsun, a minor goddess, and his father was Lugalbanda. The ratio matters to the story. Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. He's stronger than normal humans, wiser, more beautiful, but still mortal. He rules for 126 years, superhuman longevity, but not immortality. And he knows it. His entire epic is driven by this knowledge that despite his divine heritage, he will die. He seeks the immortal Utnapishtim to learn the secret of eternal life. And Utnapishtim explains that immortality was granted as a one-time exception after the flood, not something achievable otherwise. But what does 2/3 divine even mean? How do you calculate such a ratio? If his mother was fully Anunnaki and his father was half human, the mathematics work he'd be 3/4 divine, not 2/3. If his mother was fully divine and his father was fully human, he'd be half divine. The ratio 2/3 divine suggests something more complex. Perhaps his father Lugalbanda was 1/3 divine himself, making Gilgamesh the result of compounding hybrid ancestry over generations. The text treats this as important, as if the precise genetic ratio determined precise capabilities and limitations. Other texts describe different ratios with different results. The Apkallu, the 7 sages who served as advisors to the earliest kings, are described as a distinct category, neither fully Anunnaki nor fully human, but something else. They're depicted in art as fish-human hybrids, though this is likely symbolic. They possess wisdom and knowledge beyond humans, but lack the full power of the Anunnaki. They serve as intermediaries, translators, teachers who can bridge the gap between divine knowledge and human understanding. Throughout the king lists and royal inscriptions, certain families maintain power across generations, always claiming direct descent from specific Anunnaki deities. The kings of Uruk claimed descent from Inanna, the kings of Babylon from Marduk, the kings of Lagash from Ningirsu. This wasn't symbolic patronage. The texts treat it as biological inheritance, as bloodlines that conferred legitimacy and capability. Kings who lost power are sometimes explicitly described as not of the divine lineage, as if genetic testing had revealed they were imposters. Why did this matter so much? The texts suggest that divine heritage conferred measurable advantages. Longer life, though not immortality. Greater physical strength and endurance. Wisdom beyond normal human capacity. The ability to communicate with the Anunnaki or access their knowledge. Perhaps even slower aging or different disease resistance. The antediluvian kings with their millennia-long reigns represented maximum divine heritage. The post-flood kings with their century-long reigns represented diluted bloodlines. And eventually, by the historical period, kings lived normal human lifespans, the divine genetics having diluted below functional significance. This creates an unsettling picture of what the Mesopotamians believed about themselves. They thought humanity had been genetically engineered as workers. They thought the Anunnaki had interbred with some humans, creating hybrid bloodlines with enhanced capabilities. They thought these bloodlines mattered, conferred real advantages, and gradually weakened over time as the genetics mixed and diluted. They maintained careful records of who had what percentage of divine ancestry because they believed it determined capability and authority, as if they were documenting the slow loss of something valuable, watching their species gradually become fully human, fully mortal, fully cut off from the genetic enhancement that the earliest generations possessed. We return to those mysterious objects called the Me, because the more you read about them in the texts, the less they sound like abstract divine attributes, and the more they sound like actual technologies or tools. In Inanna and Enki, the goddess gets Enki drunk and steals over 100 Me from him. The list includes predictable things like priesthood and kingship, but also oddly specific items: the art of the woodworker, the art of metalworking, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the kindling of strife, the setting up of lamentations. These aren't behaviors or concepts, they're described as discrete things that can be possessed, transferred, stolen. Enki keeps them in his shrine in the Abzu, the underground realm beneath Eridu. Inanna loads them onto her boat of heaven to transport them to her city of Uruk. The texts treat them as actual objects or technologies that enabled civilization, and the question haunts every translation. What were the me really, and could they be used again? Let's examine the complete list more carefully, because its strangeness increases with attention. Among the me Enki possessed and Inanna stole are lordship, godship, the noble crown, the throne of kingship, the noble scepter, the staff, the noble garment, shepherdship, kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the eunuch, the female prostitute, the kissing of the phallus, the art of lovemaking, the art of song, eldership, heroship, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, the troubled heart, judgment, decision-making, the craft of the metal worker, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the basket weaver, wisdom, attention, holy purification, fear, awe, strife, victory, counsel, the troubled heart, judgment, decision, and over 60 more. Read that list again. Some items are social roles, kingship, priesthood, prostitution. Some are emotions, fear, awe, strife. Some are practical skills, metalworking, leatherworking, building. Some are sexual practices. Some are administrative functions. Some are military capabilities. Some are what we'd call psychological states. And some, like descent and ascent from the underworld, sound like actual abilities or technologies for traveling between realms. They're all mixed together as if they're the same type of thing, as if roles and emotions and skills and impossible abilities were all transferable items in the same category. The text describes Inanna's theft methodically. She arrives at Eridu where Enki dwells. They feast together. Enki drinks beer. The text emphasizes his drinking repeatedly, as if his intoxication is crucial to what follows. As he becomes drunk, Inanna asks for the me one by one, and Enki, in his impaired state, keeps giving them to her. The text lists them group by group, and after each group, it notes Enki gave them to Inanna. She accepts them, loads them onto her boat of heaven, and prepares to leave. When Enki sobers up, he realizes what he's done. He sends his minister Isimud to retrieve the me, but Inanna has already departed. Isimud pursues her, catching up at each of 6 stopping points on her journey to Uruk. At each location, Inanna's assistant Ninshuba confronts Isimud, and Inanna refuses to return the me. Finally, she reaches Uruk's territory, and once the me cross into her city's boundaries, they become hers by law. Enki can't take them back by force because that would violate divine law regarding city territories. The me now belong to Uruk because Inanna brought them there. What follows is significant. Uruk transforms. The text describes the city gaining capabilities it didn't have before. The arts flourish. Governance becomes more sophisticated. The me brought by Inanna make Uruk into one of the greatest cities of ancient Mesopotamia. Other cities envy Uruk's possession of so many me. Wars are fought partly to capture me from conquered cities. The texts treat them as strategic resources, as things that determine a civilization's capability and sophistication. So what were they physically? The texts call them me, a Sumerian word without clear etymology. They're described as being kept in Enki's shrine, as being transportable, as being loadable onto Inanna's boat. They're described as conferring abilities or enabling practices to whoever possesses them. They're described as needing protection because losing them means losing capabilities. They sound less like abstract concepts given physical form in mythology and more like actual devices or information, storage systems, or perhaps genetic or technological templates that enabled specific human capabilities and needed to be physically present in a city for those capabilities to function. Could they have been data storage? Knowledge bases containing instructions for various crafts and social organizations, genetic samples enabling certain traits, technological devices that enabled various functions. The Sumerian language had no words for such things, so the scribes called them me and described them as best they could, divine powers, transferable, essential to civilization, kept by Enki who brought them from wherever the Anunnaki originated, distributed to cities where they enabled human development. Whether technology or magic, the texts insist they were real, were crucial, were jealously guarded, and could theoretically be lost if the Anunnaki departed and took them away, which, according to the arc of Mesopotamian history, is exactly what eventually happened. Scattered throughout Mesopotamian literature are references to cycles, to appointed times, to periods when the Anunnaki would return. These aren't presented as hopeful prophecies of divine blessing, but often as warnings of times requiring preparation. The texts speak of the day of judgment, of times when accounts would be settled, of periods when humanity would be evaluated. In Akkadian prophecy texts, there are references to specific celestial configurations that would mark times of chaos and divine intervention. The scribes copied and recopied these warnings across centuries, as if preserving crucial information about timing. In temple archives, astronomical texts were kept alongside the myths and king lists, suggesting that watching the sky wasn't just religious practice, but preparation, monitoring for signs that the time of return was approaching. The Akkadian prophecy texts, dating from the second millennium BCE onward, are among the most unsettling documents in the cuneiform archives. They're written as if from the future, describing events that will happen in cycles that repeat. They speak of times when the gods will return to judge the earth, when the great gods will descend to settle accounts, when kingship will change hands according to ancient decree. These aren't vague apocalyptic visions, they include astronomical markers, specific signs that would indicate the approach of these periods. One prophecy text describes signs in the heavens, when certain planets align, when specific constellations rise at specific times, when the moon exhibits particular behaviors. The text treats these as countdown markers, as if someone who knew how to read the sky could calculate when the critical period was approaching. Temple astronomer priests were tasked with watching for these signs, with maintaining continuous observation, with recording any celestial event that might indicate the cycle was completing. Why did this matter so much? The text suggests that when the Anunnaki returned, there would be judgment. Not moral judgment necessarily, but evaluation. Assessment of how well humanity had maintained civilization, how well the hybrid bloodlines had preserved their heritage, how well the knowledge given had been stewarded. The tone isn't, the gods will come back and everything will be wonderful. The tone is, the gods will come back and there will be an accounting. So be prepared. Maintain the proper practices, preserve the knowledge, watch the signs. Some texts speak more specifically about what would happen during these return periods. Social upheaval, the rise and fall of kingdoms, natural disasters, war, plague, as if the transition periods when the Anunnaki's presence or absence was shifting created instability, as if the boundary conditions between whatever heaven represented and earth became chaotic during these crossing times. The texts advise proper ritual, proper maintenance of temples, proper observation of protocols, not for spiritual salvation but for surviving the transition intact. In the temple archives at multiple sites, archaeologists found astronomical texts filed together with prophecy texts and king lists, as if these were related documents that needed to be consulted together. The astronomical texts provided the data what was actually happening in the sky. The prophecy texts provided the interpretation what these celestial events signified. The king lists provided the historical pattern what had happened during previous critical periods. Together, they formed a monitoring system, a way of tracking where humanity was in the larger cycle and what to expect next. The scribes who maintained these archives took their role seriously. They copied texts precisely. They added annotations noting where source material was damaged. They cross-referenced between documents. They updated astronomical observations while preserving ancient prophecies. As if they understood, they were maintaining an early warning system. As if they believed that somewhere in these texts was crucial information about timing, about when to expect the return, about how to prepare for it. And they preserved warnings about what happened if you weren't prepared. References to previous times when the Anunnaki returned and found things not maintained properly. References to divine anger, to destruction, to punishment of cities that had forgotten or abandoned proper protocols. Not moral lessons, but practical warnings. If you don't maintain the systems, if you don't watch the signs, if you're caught unprepared when the return happens, the consequences will be severe. As if the temples were outposts in a colony, as if the astronomer priests were watchmen maintaining surveillance, as if all of this elaborate religious infrastructure was actually a monitoring and communication system designed to ensure humanity would be ready when the administrators came back to check on what had been built and given. In Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu is the underground freshwater ocean where Enki dwells. It's described as beneath Eridu, a place of great importance that humans couldn't normally access. But the physical descriptions in the texts are oddly specific. The Abzu is described as having foundations, as being built, as containing chambers and workshops where Enki creates things and makes plans. It's described as a place of great knowledge, where destiny is determined. Archaeological excavations at Eridu never found anything resembling the Abzu described in texts. No vast underground chamber, no subterranean workshops, which raises an uncomfortable question. Were the Sumerians describing something that was once there but is now gone, sealed, or hidden? Or were they using the term Abzu to describe something else entirely? Something underground or beneath the surface that their language struggled to capture accurately. The word Abzu in Sumerian is written with the signs A, B, Zu, which can mean deep water or primeval sea. In the creation myths, the Abzu existed before creation itself, the primordial fresh water beneath the earth from which all life emerged. But in other texts, the Abzu is described not as a natural formation but as Enki's constructed dwelling place. The Enuma Elish describes how Enki established his abode in the Abzu and laid its foundations. The language suggests building, engineering, deliberate construction, rather than occupying a natural cave or water source. The texts describe the Abzu as being beneath Eridu, accessible through chambers that descend into the earth. It's described as a place of great power, where the Mi are stored, where Enki conducts his work of creating and planning. In multiple myths, other Anunnaki journey to the Abzu to consult with Enki, to seek his wisdom, to ask for his help in solving problems. They descend into it. The journey is described as going down into the earth, into depths humans couldn't access without permission and guidance. The Abzu is also associated with fresh water that flows up through springs and rivers. The Sumerians understood hydrology. They knew that fresh water came from underground sources, from aquifers fed by distant rainfall. The Tigris and Euphrates, they believed, were fed by the Abzu, by underground waters flowing up from Enki's domain. This wasn't entirely wrong. The rivers were fed partially by springs and underground water. But the texts treat the Abzu as more than just groundwater. They treat it as a specific place, with specific architecture, with specific functions beyond just being the source of fresh water. When archaeologists excavated Eridu, they dug down through multiple temple levels, reaching depths below the current water table. They found evidence of sophisticated drainage systems, of channels for managing water flow, of engineering that dealt with the high water table in the marshy delta region. But they found no vast underground chambers, no workshops, no evidence of the extensive subterranean architecture the texts describe. The Abzu, as described in mythology, simply wasn't there, which leads to several possibilities. Perhaps the Abzu was somewhere else, not literally under Eridu, but metaphorically associated with it. Perhaps it was on the shore of the Persian Gulf, in areas now underwater due to sea level rise over millennia. Perhaps it was a natural cave system that's since collapsed or been sealed. Perhaps the texts are purely mythological, and the Abzu never existed as a physical place at all. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that makes archaeologists most uncomfortable, the Abzu was removed. If it was built, it could be unbuilt. If it was a facility, it could be dismantled when the Anunnaki departed. The texts describe Enki keeping precious things there, the me, the secrets of creation, the plans and knowledge that enabled civilization. If the Anunnaki left Earth, they might have taken these resources with them, sealed the facility, removed the evidence, leaving only the memory in texts, only the stories of a place beneath Eridu where Enki dwelled and worked and planned, where the foundations of civilization were designed and stored. Another interpretation, proposed by some researchers, the word Abzu might not refer to a physical underground location at all, but to something else the Sumerians lacked words to describe precisely, something beneath or below in a different sense. Another dimension, another realm, another location accessed through technology rather than through digging down. The texts use spatial language descending into the Abzu, returning from the Abzu, but perhaps these were the only terms available for describing movement between different places or states that weren't connected by normal geography. What's undeniable is that the Abzu appears throughout Mesopotamian texts as crucially important. It's where Enki keeps his power. It's where creation happens. It's where knowledge resides. It's the source of life-giving water. It's forbidden to humans except under special circumstances. And despite its importance, despite detailed descriptions, despite being allegedly beneath their oldest and most sacred city, no one has ever found physical evidence that it existed. The Abzu remains what it was in ancient texts, a place of power and knowledge, described as real and important, but whose actual nature and location remains a mystery that archaeology cannot resolve. If the early texts describe the Anunnaki as present and active on Earth, later texts increasingly depict them as distant, as having withdrawn. By the time of the Babylonian period, the myths describe gods who must be invoked, ritually summoned, who no longer walk among humans as the earliest texts described. Something changed. The texts don't explicitly explain this transition, but it's there in the narrative arc of Mesopotamian literature, a shift from gods as resident administrators to gods as distant powers requiring elaborate ritual to contact. Did they leave? Were they sealed away? Did something happen that forced a withdrawal? The texts preserve rituals meant to call them back, to open gates between realms, to restore communication that had been lost, as if humanity had been left behind with instructions to maintain things until return was possible. The change happens gradually in the texts, but it's undeniable. The earliest Sumerian myths from around 2600 BCE describe the Anunnaki as physically present, living in their cities, intervening directly in human affairs. Enlil walks among humans. Enki teaches personally. Inanna travels from city to city. The gods attend councils, make decisions, enforce them directly. Humans interact with them face to face, or at least the kings and priests do. The relationship is immediate, tangible, administrative. By the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, the tone begins shifting. The gods are still active but increasingly remote. They communicate through dreams, through omens, through priests. They must be invoked through elaborate ritual. The texts describe complex ceremonies required to gain divine attention, as if the gods are no longer automatically present, as if humans must work harder to establish contact. The rituals become more elaborate, more specific, more desperate in their complexity. By the Neo-Babylonian period around 600 BCE, the transformation is complete. The gods are described as dwelling in distant heaven, occasionally sending messages or manifestations, but no longer physically present on earth. The temples are still maintained, the rituals still performed, but there's an air of absence to the texts. The gods must be called, must be persuaded to pay attention, must be convinced to intervene. They're no longer resident administrators, but distant authorities who sometimes respond to petitions and sometimes don't. What happened? The texts never explicitly say the Anunnaki departed on this date for these reasons, but they preserve fragments of explanation scattered across different sources, references to the gods withdrawing to heaven, mentions of gates being sealed, descriptions of rituals that used to bring direct divine presence, but no longer do, now maintained out of tradition and hope, as if the connection between heaven and earth that had once been open had closed, and no one alive remembered exactly when or why. Some tablets describe catastrophes that required the gods' departure, wars among the Anunnaki themselves, disasters that made Earth uninhabitable for them, decisions made at councils that humans weren't privy to. Other texts suggest the withdrawal was planned, was always intended, was part of a cycle, that the Anunnaki came for a specific purpose, accomplished it, and departed once that phase was complete. The later texts preserve what scholars call gate-opening rituals, complex ceremonies meant to re-establish connection between earth and heaven, to open the pathways that had been closed, to allow communication or travel between realms that had been separated. These rituals were performed at specific times during certain celestial configurations, at certain festivals, at moments when the boundary between worlds was believed to be thinner, as if the separation wasn't absolute, as if during certain periods or under certain conditions, the gate could still be opened, contact could still be made, messages could still be sent or received. Temple priests became specialists in these invocation rituals. Their entire role shifted from hosting resident deities to attempting to summon distant ones. The complexity increased over centuries, as if each generation had to work harder to achieve what previous generations had accomplished more easily, as if whatever had once made contact easy was fading, weakening, requiring more effort and more precise technique to overcome. The priests preserved the rituals meticulously, copying them across generations, because they believed these procedures were humanity's lifeline to the departed Anunnaki, the only remaining way to reach those who had left but might someday return. And throughout the later texts, there's a sense of waiting, of maintenance, of keeping things ready. The temples remain staffed, the offerings continue, the astronomical observations persist, the ziggurat summit shrines stay furnished and provisioned, all of it maintained according to ancient instructions, kept current despite the absence, as if the priests understood they were caretakers of facilities that would eventually be needed again when the withdrawal period ended and presence was restored. As if departure was never meant to be permanent, only a temporary phase in a much longer cycle that would eventually come full circle. The Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish both describe human creation in terms that sound disturbingly biological. The goddess Ninhursag, also called Nintu, is called the Mother Goddess, who fashions mankind. But the process described isn't magical. She takes clay from the Abzu and mixes it with the blood of a slaughtered god named Wi-ila, or Geshtui. Then she creates humans in batches, experimenting with the mixture until she achieves the desired result. 7 male and 7 female at first. The text describes failures and adjustments. It describes genetic material being mixed, incubation, birth. Modern readers struggle with these passages because, stripped of poetic interpretation, they sound like descriptions of genetic engineering, of taking existing biological material and modifying it to create a new species with specific capabilities. Intelligent enough to understand instructions, capable enough to work complex tasks, but designed to serve. The question isn't whether the Sumerians could have understood genetics. Clearly they couldn't with our terminology. The question is whether they were trying to describe something they had witnessed using the only words their language possessed. Let's examine the Atrahasis account more closely, because the biological specificity is remarkable. When the Igigi rebel and demand relief from their labor, Enki proposes creating a replacement workforce. But he doesn't suggest creating humans from nothing. He specifies that there are already primitive humans on Earth. The text calls them Lulu, meaning mixed creature or primitive man. These beings exist but lack sufficient intelligence for complex labor. Enki's solution is to enhance them, to modify what already exists rather than create from nothing. Ninhursag is chosen for this task because she's the specialist in shaping living things. Her titles include Nintu, lady who gives birth, and Mummy, mother. The process she uses is described step by step. First, a god must be sacrificed. The text is specific. It must be a god with intelligence, with understanding, with the divine essence of wisdom. They choose Wi-ila, one of the rebelling Igigi, and slaughter him. His blood is collected, his flesh is prepared. This isn't symbolic. The text uses the Akkadian words for actual butchering, for the collection of blood, for the preparation of tissue. Then comes the mixing. Ninhursag takes clay from the Abzu. But what is this clay? In Sumerian and Akkadian, the word used is tit, or titu, which can mean clay, but also means something closer to primordial matter, or base material. She mixes this with the divine blood and flesh. The text describes her working the mixture, kneading it, preparing it. Modern translators usually say she fashioned or molded humans, but the Akkadian verbs suggest something more like mixing substances, combining materials, working with formulas and proportions. The next phase is described as creating 14 beings, 7 male, 7 female, but these are described as first attempts. Ninhursag creates them in a special place, incubates them, brings them to term. The language used parallels normal birth descriptions in other texts, but with additional technical details that seem strange. References to specific durations, to environmental conditions, to procedures that must be followed precisely, as if she's describing not spontaneous creation but a technical process with specific parameters and protocols. Then come the failures. The text describes Ninhursag experimenting, adjusting, creating beings with various problems. Some can't reproduce, some lack sufficient intelligence, some are physically malformed. She adjusts the mixture, changes the proportions, tries again. The process is iterative, experimental, described the way a modern scientist might describe refining a procedure through trial and error. Finally, she achieves the desired result. Humans with sufficient intelligence to understand and follow complex instructions, with sufficient physical capability to perform hard labor, but with limited lifespans and controlled fertility to prevent overpopulation. The texts specify what was gained from the divine blood. Intelligence beyond normal animal consciousness, language capability, understanding of complex concepts, the ability to learn skills and pass them on. These aren't described as gifts from the gods in some mystical sense, but as traits that came from mixing divine biological material with primitive human stock, as if intelligence itself was genetic, transferable through physical means, something that could be added to an existing species through biotechnology. Modern readers equipped with knowledge of genetics, DNA, gene editing, and cloning can't help but see parallels. The Sumerians lacked these concepts, lacked this vocabulary. If they witnessed or were told about genetic modification, about the enhancement of existing humans through the addition of Anunnaki DNA, about the creation of a modified species through controlled breeding and genetic engineering, how would they describe it? They'd use the words they had. They'd call the genetic material blood and flesh. They'd call the base human stock clay or earth. They'd describe the laboratory or facility as a workshop or chamber. They'd call the process mixing and fashioning. They'd describe trial and error as experimentation, using whatever vocabulary existed. The question that haunts anyone reading these texts carefully is simple. Are we reading mythology that happens to use biological language metaphorically, or are we reading descriptions of actual biological engineering, preserved as accurately as possible by scribes who didn't understand the science but recorded the process faithfully, maintaining the memory of how human civilization's workforce was created through genetic modification by beings who possessed that technology and used it for specific purposes that the texts describe with uncomfortable clarity? The biblical story of the Tower of Babel is set in Babylon, and linguistic analysis suggests it's based on Mesopotamian traditions about the Anunnaki ziggurat, but there's a deeper layer to this story that connects back to the Anunnaki. In the biblical version, humans build a tower to reach heaven, and God confuses their language to prevent completion. But the older Mesopotamian traditions frame this differently. The ziggurats were built specifically to provide places for the gods to descend, to cross between heaven and earth. The concern wasn't human presumption, but the opposite. These were landing platforms, places of contact, meeting points between two realms. When the biblical text says the tower was meant to reach to the heavens, it might have originally meant it was built to facilitate descent from the heavens. And if the Anunnaki did withdraw, if contact was lost, then humanity continuing to build and maintain these structures despite the absence could be seen as either faithful preparation for return or dangerous invitation to force a return before appointed time. The biblical text in Genesis chapter 11 is brief but specific. It places the event in Shinar, the Hebrew name for Babylon. It describes humans building a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. It says God came down to look at what was being built and declared, nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them if they remain unified with one language. So God confuses their language, scatters them across the earth, and the tower remains unfinished. The name Babel is explained as coming from Balal, meaning confusion. But the older Mesopotamian sources tell a different story about the same structure. The Anunnaki ziggurat in Babylon was the tallest structure in ancient Mesopotamia, approximately 90 meters tall with 7 stages. Its name means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, which is revealing. Not a tower to storm heaven, but a temple to mark where heaven and earth connect, where the boundary between realms can be crossed. The foundation myth of the Anunnaki describes Marduk himself commanding its construction, specifying its dimensions, declaring it would serve as his resting place when he visits Earth. Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described the ziggurat in detail. He noted that at the summit was a shrine with a large couch where, locals told him, the god would rest when visiting. No human was allowed to spend the night there except one woman chosen by the god himself. This wasn't symbolic spiritual union. The locals described it as if actual physical visitation was expected, as if the structure's purpose was to provide accommodation for a descending visitor, not to allow humans to ascend to heaven. The Mesopotamian building texts for ziggurats consistently describe them as stairways to heaven. They're stairs that allow descent from heaven to earth, not ascent from earth to heaven. The shrines at the top are called bond between heaven and earth, meeting place, gate. These structures mark designated locations where the boundary between realms can be crossed, where visitors from heaven can descend to earth through an established portal or landing point. If the Anunnaki had indeed withdrawn, if they were no longer descending to these prepared locations, then humanity maintaining and rebuilding these structures takes on different significance. Were they keeping the facilities ready for anticipated return? Or were they attempting to force return, to reopen gates that had been intentionally closed, to restore contact before the appointed time? The biblical text suggests the latter, that the Tower Project was presumptuous, was attempting something that shouldn't be attempted, was dangerous enough that it needed to be stopped. The confusion of languages in the biblical account might preserve memory of something real. The Mesopotamian texts note that in ancient times, before the dispersion of peoples, there was greater unity. The Sumerian text Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta explicitly states that in ancient times, the whole universe, the people in unison, spoke to Enlil in one tongue. Then something changed. Peoples separated, languages diverged, communication became difficult. The biblical text attributes this to divine intervention at Babel. The Mesopotamian sources are less explicit, but suggest the same transition, a shift from unified humanity under Anunnaki administration to dispersed peoples developing separately. What if the scattering wasn't punishment but safety measure? If humans unified and organized could actually reopen contact, could rebuild the technology or ritual practice necessary to force the gate open, then dispersing them and confusing their languages would prevent such coordination, would ensure that return happened only when intended, only when conditions were appropriate, only when humanity was ready or the cycle was complete. The tower projects would continue. Ziggurats were built for another 1,000 years after Babylon's peak, but they'd never quite achieve their purpose, never quite restore the contact they were designed to facilitate, remaining as monuments to an absent presence, maintained in faithful hope but never quite reconnecting with what they were built to reach. When archaeologists first began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 19th century, they found something strange in multiple locations. Tablets that had been deliberately buried in foundation deposits, sealed in copper boxes, hidden beneath temple corners. These weren't archives. They were time capsules, information intentionally preserved for future discovery. Some contained building inscriptions and royal propaganda, yes, but others contained astronomical texts, ritual instructions, and warnings about proper procedures and appointed times. As if the ancient scribes knew their civilization would fall, knew the knowledge would be lost, but were desperately trying to preserve specific information for whoever came after. They were talking to us across millennia, and the question that haunts every excavation is whether we're understanding what they were trying so urgently to communicate. Whether the warnings they buried are ones we need now, in our time, as we decode their messages and unwittingly fulfill prophecies about bringing ancient knowledge back to light. Foundation deposits were standard practice in Mesopotamian construction. When building a temple or palace, the builders would place a deposit beneath the corners or under key points in the structure. Typically, these contained inscriptions identifying the king who built it, prayers to the patron deity, valuable objects as offerings. Standard practice, well understood, routine, but some deposits were different, sealed more carefully, hidden more deliberately, containing texts that seemed chosen specifically for long-term preservation rather than for blessing the building itself. At Sippar, archaeologists found a foundation deposit from the time of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon in the 6th century BCE. It contained tablets wrapped in cloth, sealed in a copper cylinder, buried deep beneath a temple corner. When opened, the tablets proved to be astronomical texts, calculation tables for planetary movements, eclipse predictions, star catalogues. Why bury astronomical data beneath a temple? Why preserve it so carefully if it was just reference material that priests used regularly? Unless the goal was to ensure this information survived, even if the civilization fell, even if the knowledge was lost, for someone in the future who would excavate and discover and hopefully understand. At Uruk, foundation deposits contained copies of ancient king lists and chronicles dating back to periods even the Babylonians considered ancient. These weren't the normal inscriptions praising the current king. These were historical documents, copies of copies, traced back through multiple generations of scribes. As if someone decided, our civilization is failing, our knowledge is being lost, but we must preserve these specific records, must hide them where they'll survive the collapse, where future excavators will find them and understand what we were, what we knew, what we remembered. At Babylon itself, in the foundations of the Anunnaki, archaeologists found ritual texts, detailed procedures for gate-opening ceremonies, for invocations meant to re-establish contact with departed deities, for astronomical observations that marked appropriate times for these attempts. These weren't texts for daily temple use. They were specialized knowledge, carefully copied, deliberately preserved, as if someone believed this information would be crucial in the future. That whoever came after needed to know these specific procedures, these specific timings, these specific protocols for attempting to restore what had been lost. The scribes who created these deposits sometimes added notes. I have written this for distant days, for the king who comes after, who seeks understanding, so that future generations might know. They knew they were preserving information across time. They knew their civilization wouldn't last forever. They knew knowledge could be lost, and they made deliberate choices about what to preserve, what to hide, what to ensure survived for whoever came after. What haunts modern archaeologists is the question, did they succeed? When we excavate these deposits, decode these tablets, publish the texts in modern languages, distribute the knowledge worldwide through academic channels and internet databases, are we fulfilling exactly what the ancient scribes hoped for? Are we the future generations they were preserving this knowledge for? And if so, what were they trying to tell us? What warnings did they consider urgent enough to preserve through millennia? What information about cycles and returns and astronomical markers did they believe we would need? The timing is unsettling. Most of these foundation deposits were created during periods of civilizational decline, during the final centuries of Mesopotamian independence, before conquest by Persia, Greece, Rome, as if the scribes could see the end coming and were desperately preserving what they could before the knowledge vanished. They succeeded better than they knew. Their tablets survived. We found them. We decoded them. We published them. The knowledge they preserved is now accessible to anyone with internet connection. We've fulfilled their hope. The question is whether we understand what they were preserving and why they thought it would matter to us. Now, in our time, as we live through what might be the very transition periods their astronomical texts warned about, the Sumerians divided the zodiac into 12 houses and tracked the precession of equinoxes, the slow backwards drift of which constellation appears at sunrise on the spring equinox. Each age lasts roughly 2,160 years, and the complete cycle takes 25,800 years. We're currently transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. The Sumerians associated these ages with different divine rulerships, different configurations of power among the Anunnaki. Some scholars of ancient texts point to cylinder seals and astronomical tablets that seem to mark certain ages as times of return, times when the boundary between heaven and earth becomes thin again, times when what was separated might reconnect. Whether through actual celestial mechanics or symbolic cosmic rhythm, the ancient texts treat these transitions as significant as periods of potential chaos, judgment, and the return of those who departed. We're in such a transition now, the text would suggest. And if the warnings were real, if the timelines were accurate, if the Anunnaki's departure was temporary rather than permanent, then our age, this specific period we're living through, would be exactly when the ancient scribes would expect us to need their warnings most. Understanding precession requires understanding something most people never think about. Due to Earth's wobble on its axis, the position of stars shifts slightly each year. The vernal equinox sunrise on the first day of spring occurs when the sun crosses the celestial equator. But which constellation the sun appears in front of during this crossing changes very slowly over time. The sun moves backwards through the zodiac, spending approximately 2,160 years in each sign. The complete cycle through all 12 signs takes 25,800 years. The Sumerians knew this. In 3000 BCE, they knew about a cycle that takes longer than recorded human history to complete. They incorporated it into their astronomical texts and into their mythology. They associated each age with different divine rulership, as if cosmic authority shifted as the ages changed. They marked certain ages as particularly significant transition ages, where the boundary between one epoch and another created instability, opportunity, danger. We're living through such a transition now. The age of Pisces, which lasted approximately from the time of Christ until now, is ending. The age of Aquarius is beginning. The exact date of transition is debated. Some say it's already happened. Others say it won't complete until 2150, but everyone agrees we're in the transition period. The overlap where one age bleeds into the next, where old patterns break down and new ones haven't yet solidified. The ancient texts treat such transitions with special attention. They're not routine shifts, but critical periods, times when what was sealed might be opened, when what was separated might reconnect, when conditions that allowed the Anunnaki presence might recur. The astronomical markers they preserved, the cycles they calculated, the prophecies they encoded, many of them point to transition ages as times requiring vigilance, preparation, understanding of what might return. Consider what the texts consistently describe. The Anunnaki came, they taught, they ruled, they departed. But departure was always framed as temporary, as phase in a larger cycle. They would return. The texts specify this repeatedly. Return is coming. Judgment is coming. Evaluation is coming. And the time of return is connected to celestial cycles, to the completion of large astronomical periods, to ages transitioning in ways that shift cosmic conditions and allow what was impossible to become possible again. If we take the texts at their word, if we accept their warnings as genuine, this transition we're living through from Pisces to Aquarius would be exactly the kind of period the ancient scribes were trying to warn us about. The kind of time when boundaries thin, when gates might open, when return becomes possible. Whether you interpret this literally as actual return of actual beings, or symbolically as return of ancient knowledge, ancient patterns, ancient ways of understanding the texts, insist this period matters. This transition we're experiencing isn't random, but part of cycle the Sumerians tracked, calculated, preserved, and warned about. The warnings weren't optimistic. They weren't, the gods will return and fix everything. They were, the gods will return and judge what you've done, how you've maintained things, how you've developed, whether you're ready. Proper understanding, maintenance of knowledge, watching the signs, being ready for evaluation, not in fear exactly, but in awareness that cycles complete themselves, that what departed eventually returns, that the ancient administrators who left humanity to develop might be coming back to see what we've made of ourselves and the world we were given. Whether this is literally true, whether actual Anunnaki beings will return during this astronomical transition, or whether it's metaphorical wisdom about cycles of history, the pattern is clear in the texts. What they preserved, what they warned about, what they calculated and tracked and buried in foundation deposits for future generations to find it, all points to times of transition as times requiring special attention, special preparation, special awareness that we're not just living through random history, but through a cycle that the ancients mapped, that they believed would repeat, that they thought we would need to understand when our turn came to live through what they once experienced and barely survived. And so the story rests where it began, in fragments of baked clay beneath the Iraqi desert, in cuneiform marks pressed 5,000 years ago by scribes who believed they were preserving something urgent. Whether they were recording mythology or documenting memory, whether the Anunnaki were gods or visitors or something we still lack words to name properly, the ancient Mesopotamians left us their warnings, their calculations, their careful observations of the sky. They buried their knowledge in foundation deposits and copied it across centuries, as if speaking directly to us, across the vast gulf of time, hoping we would find it and understand. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you're looking at the same stars the Sumerian astronomer priests watched from their ziggurats. The same constellations wheel overhead. The same planets trace their paths through the zodiac. The celestial cycles they calculated with such precision continue turning. Indifferent to whether civilizations rise or fall, whether knowledge is preserved or lost, whether warnings are heeded or forgotten, we're connected to them through these cycles. Through the questions we still ask about who we are and where we came from, through the same human impulse to watch the heavens and wonder what might return. Perhaps the Anunnaki were real and their return is coming. Perhaps they were how ancient minds made sense of civilization's mysterious emergence. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between, in territories we don't yet have language to map. The tablets can't tell us which interpretation is correct. They can only preserve the mystery, hold the questions, remind us that humanity has been searching for these answers since we first learned to write, since we first looked up at the night sky and felt small beneath something vast and ancient and ongoing. So let yourself drift now into that same darkness those ancient scribes knew. Under those same stars they tracked with such intensity. The clay tablets rest in museum cases, their warnings preserved, their timelines maintained, their knowledge waiting for whoever needs it. The ziggurats stand in ruins, still pointing toward heaven, still marking where earth and sky were meant to meet. And you rest here, between past and future, between knowing and mystery, part of the same long human story of wondering, watching, and waiting to understand. Sleep now. The ancient world will still be here when you wake, still holding its secrets, still waiting to tell us what it remembers about where we came from and what might be returning.